I want to welcome everyone to the magical appeal of moss landscape designs. This is one of the webinars we are offering in this season's A Focus on Sustainability. This webinar series was developed by a group of organizations known regionally in the United States for their quality ecological programs. By working together, we're able to expand the reach of these educational programs via the webinar series. In case you're not familiar with these organizations, they are all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, ELA, in the Northeast, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, CCLC, in the Washington, D.C. area, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, MELA, in the Chicago area, and Eco-Landscape California, ELC, on the West Coast. If you have any questions for the presenter during tonight's presentation, you can post a question in the question window at any time during the broadcast. We'll take one Q&A break about halfway through, and then we'll take follow-up questions at the end of the presentation. And now let's get started. Annie Martin, known as Moss and Annie, is the owner of Mountain Moss. Her gardens and nursery are located in the mountains of western North Carolina. Many of us are passionate about plants, but Annie is passionate about moss. In addition to cultivating moss at Mountain Moss, Annie is known to travel around with a 12-foot extension ladder in the back of her pickup truck, ready to rescue moss from rooftops destined for construction, with prior permission, of course. Although many of us grow moss unintentionally in walkway crevices, Annie has taken moss cultivation and garden design to a whole new level. She designs and installs residential moss landscapes and sells moss on her website, www.mountainmoss.com. Annie's goal is to facilitate the introduction of mosses as viable horticultural choices that offer aesthetic beauty as well as environmental solutions. Annie will be sharing her passion for moss gardening in her upcoming book to be published by Timber Press next spring. Be on the lookout for the magical world of moss gardening. We're delighted to have her join us for this webinar and to introduce us to the world of moss landscape design. Welcome, Annie.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Moss and Annie. That's what most folks call me. And I do love mosses. I'm really a mosser, and I wear many different hats. First and dearest to my heart is being a moss rescuer. Where I live, I've seen construction and development happen all my life. And it really hurts my heart when I see the mosses destined to be moved by the bulldozers or the loggers. After I rescue the mosses, I cultivate them at my mossery, and that's what I call my moss nursery. Well, I was born to be a moss artist too, and it's taken me a while to realize that, but this is my destiny, so that's how I ended up being a moss landscaper. Through my research, I've learned a lot, and I enjoy sharing it with other folks. So I have a lot of different educational services and do lectures and workshops. And as Penny said, soon I'm going to be a published author. My book is The Magical World of Moss Gardening, and I appreciate that Timber Press is going to publish it towards the end of next summer. I was born in the most beautiful place in the world, the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, that is, of western North Carolina. In a little town that we kind of call a city around here, Asheville. After a stint in Atlanta and Charlotte, I moved back to the mountains about 20 years ago, and now I live in the quintessential small-town USA of Brevard, North Carolina. This is my mossery, and here I cultivate all different species, some that like shade, or as you can see from this photograph, some are tolerant of sun exposures as well. And that's one of the things we'll be learning about tonight, is different species of mosses and how they can be used in sustainable landscapes. In addition to the container trays that I cultivate via field production, I'm working on pre-vegetated moss mats. You can see this one is quite a royal green carpet, and this photograph was taken last February, right before we installed it at a big project in Georgia. This is Atricum undulatum primarily. That's the name of a moss, y'all. This is my home. My moss garden has about 50 species of bryophytes. That includes mosses, liverworts, and even hornwort species. This space 5 years ago was an asphalt driveway. The transformation was absolutely amazing. And just so you know what it looks like today, I took this photograph this afternoon. There's all different species in here, and we'll discuss some of those, but you can see there's different textures. Most of the flowers or the ferns that you saw in the previous photograph have died back because it's December. Still, the rhododendron and the wild ginger and the oconee bells shine in complement to the mosses that are climacium, hypnum, theridium, polytricum, probably a few more in there, but that at a glance. My advice is based on years of research and exploring different ways to cultivate mosses. Also, I've had the privilege of creating innovative moss features in sustainable landscapes. Now, sustainable means that it's going to last, folks, and I'm very determined that every moss-scape that I create will provide years of pleasure to come. In addition, please let me that you know that I'm very committed to responsible land stewardship and all the practices that I do in regards to rescue and cultivation, shipping, etc. Tonight's topics include the aesthetics of moss gardens, the implications of the unique botanical characteristics, and believe you me, mosses are very different from other plants. There's some great environmental reasons for choosing mosses, and then I'm going to give you some tips on planting and maintaining happy mosses. Let's start with a little bit of moss terminology. Now, most of us, including me, and probably most of y'all, use moss as an all-inclusive general term. That would mean all species and everything. Unfortunately, sometimes people get the idea that it's only one kind of moss. The reality is that moss is a singular and that mosses would be plural. The colonies, right in here, can y'all see my pointer? I don't know. Anyhow, these are colonies, and they're made up of thousands of individual plants. This one's for you, Paul. Here's an individual Climacium americanum, and it grows to be about 2 inches tall. Over here, on the right side, you can see it as a colony in its most mature state, where the tops of the gametes or moss plants are probably 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter. So, just a little bit on the scientific side, mosses are actually classified as bryophytes. You'll find that common names create confusion, and I'm sure y'all have run into this before, from one region to another, and it's particularly true with mosses. Not only is it a problem within the species, just calling them by common names. But then there's all these vascular plants that have the name moss in them. And these moss fakers really confuse people when they don't perform with the incredible manner that true bryophytes or mosses will in the landscape. Now, lest you think that this is going to be too dry and scientific, mossing is fun. So I want you to know that we talked about the noun moss and whether it should be singular or plural, but there's a new noun in my vocabulary, and that's mosser. A mosser, and a happy mosser at that, is anybody who rescues moss, who loves moss, who plants moss and creates their own moss gardens, who tends to mosses. You get the general idea. So a mosser is a person that goes mossing. Mossing now takes on the status of being a verb. It's action-oriented. So if you're going to go mossing, you might be going in the woods to learn to identify mosses. You might be rescuing mosses, as Penny mentioned, from the top of a roof. It could be that you're having fun in your own moss garden. But the result of mossing is that you will be creating moss-scapes. Moss-scapes, y'all can figure that one out. It's a moss landscape. And they will be mossum. So in my moss world, awesome becomes mossum. Oh, by the way, before I leave this page, I didn't mention anything about this southern accent, but I hope you can understand it. And you notice there's no G on mossum. That's because we don't say them in the South. Okay, let's take a step back in time for a moment. Bryophytes, or mosses, truly are ancient plants. They are the oldest living land plants on planet Earth. They're 450 million years old, folks. That's amazing to me. It's actually 50 million years before there were ever any other land plants like ferns or whatever else. Mosses survived cataclysmic natural disasters, the Ice Age, meteors, floods, the list goes on. And they even witnessed the dinosaurs come and go. So, let's now let your moss journey begin. Frequently, mosses are associated with places of meditation. And in Japan, the royal temple gardens are famed for their mosses. In America, many Japanese-styled gardens use mosses, or sometimes moss fakers, and that is one way to go. But I'll tell you what, this hillbilly thinks that you can have an eclectic style, that you can use geometric designs and be very innovative in styles. You need not just niche yourself into one way of using mosses. Your path on your journey will actually be one that can lead to your own self-enlightenment. Mosses really have this special appeal that's intangible, and it's hard to explain unless you're a mosser. And once you embrace it, you'll know exactly what I mean, and you'll hear moss whispers from the past. Mosses, watching them through all the seasons is such a pleasure. The pops of color that come from my other color flowers, and I do adore my azaleas, I'll admit it. The rhododendron and the mountain laurel too. I even like stargazers for that matter. But my mosses are my constants. They're always there. throughout every season. They provide pleasure, even in the wintertime. Now, this gives you a hint. Mosses are looking pretty doggone good there, so they must not mind the cold. You'll learn a little bit more about that as we go along. You can get very creative. Think out of the box. Mosses don't have to just be this flat expanse that mimics a grass lawn. You can actually use it as an artist, and the soil becomes your canvas and the mosses become your paints. Creating whimsy or recapturing a native restoration are ways in which mosses are quite a pleasure. And of course, around any kind of a water feature, such as this little courtyard pool. Now, when you have a stone patio, they can be quite beautiful. And they look great new. But imagine if you could just enhance it and give this sense of antiquity just by adding mosses. The same thing is true with rock walls. And y'all, when you're thinking about creating a moss garden, you need to not only look at it throughout the seasons, but think about how you will enjoy it from the interior. In other words, your view from a window. I've popped this one in here. We're not going to discuss a whole lot about green roofs today or tonight, but I want to just demonstrate that mosses can live in the sun. And this is a project over at the North Carolina Arboretum in Asheville, North Carolina. It was put in several years ago, actually. So, our goal is to introduce mosses as viable plant choices to be cultivated in sustainable landscapes following right place, right moss guidelines. In other words, shade or sun. Oh! Oops, sorry about that. Okay. Now, normally if I was doing a regular lecture or a workshop, I'd engage the audience to participate. So y'all just pretend like you're talking back to me, and I'll pretend like I'm hearing some answers. And we're going to go through probably some of the ideas that you have in your head about mosses. And we'll see whether they're fact or fiction. Moss grows on the north side of trees. Think about it. True. But also, mosses can grow all around if there are moist conditions and they're conducive to good growth. If I were a Boy Scout in the Pisgah National Forest, I would not depend on this old wives' tale that mosses grow on the north side of trees, because they grow on all sides, and you would be roaming round and round in circles and just be more lost than ever. Now this one, mosses live in the shade. What do you think? Well, everybody's saying, yeah, I know that's true because I've seen them living in the shade. And indeed, you're right. Yet some species are true sun lovers and only want to live in the sun. There are other species, quite a few, that can live in shade and partial sun. Mosses like acidic soil. That's a very common question or assumption. Some do and some don't. Y'all, not all mosses are acidic lovers. A lot of them are, but there are some that naturally grow on calcareous substrates as well. So that's a factor that you need to take into consideration. Then we're going to talk a little bit about pH later on. Mosses live in moist locations. Yes, they sure do. Yeah. they do need micro-niches of moisture even if they're sun species. Mosses provide a year-round green. Well, I just showed you that in the winter, here in the mountains of North Carolina, my mosses are green. And yes, they are tolerant of freezing temperatures throughout all the seasons in all United States planting zones. Now, of course, if you live where it's covered in snow all the time, you won't be able to see that green, and they may have to go through a recovery stage after their dormancy. I don't have to experience any dormancy, though, around here. Now, mosses provide year-round green. Well, they do have these incredible bursts of color from the sporophytes that occur. And one exciting thing about mosses is that they don't follow seasons like typical flowers. And so these blooms actually occur at all times of the year based on species and sometimes just by the colony. And there's one more factor that will put a caveat to the year-round green, and that's that some species, particularly hypnum and thuidium, will turn golden when the leaf canopy is scarce. So in very early spring, before the leaves are on the tree, or maybe in super hot times in summer, they may turn a golden color. Doesn't mean they're unhealthy. They'll be thriving and still going through reproductive stages. Now, there are a few mosses that will also change color after a reproductive stage. So looking at mosses, or the bryophyta, let's see where they fit in the kingdom of plants. Here we have everything you know about. Trees, flowers, it goes on and on, ferns, lycopods, every conifers. You've got it all here in the kingdom of plants. But way over here all by itself are the bryophytes, which include the mosses, and then the liverworts and the hornworts. And here, as one of their companions, is the lowly little algae. So mosses are in a category that's all by themselves, and for good reason. There's over 20,000 species of bryophytes. If you break that down among the three main kinds, you end up with 10,000 plus mosses, 8,000 plus liverworts, and maybe only 100 hornworts. That's why I had such enthusiasm in my voice when I told you that I had hornwort species growing in my front yard. Moss plants are a little bit different too. The brown parts at the bottom of a plant are not roots, they're just old growth. The leaves will be there, and then there's a seta and a spore capsule that appear on the sporophytic stage of a moss. Now you may ask, what in the world is a sporophyte? Annie, why are you using these scientific terms that I don't even know what you're talking about? Well, to put it as simply as I can, a sporophyte would be the equivalent of a flower, and then spores that are encapsulated within the capsule and then later dispersed are the equivalent of a seed in vascular plants. Look how spectacular these moss species are. Each sporophyte is unique to the bryophyte species. Sometimes it's very helpful to find mosses in sporophytic stage to assist in your efforts for identification. But for instance, the leucobrium they only get about half an inch tall. The atricum sporophytes will be about 1.5 inches, and they go through stages with all ombre shades of goldens and greens, and then they mature, and eventually spores are dispersed. Now, let's get into a little bit of bryophyte botany. Like vascular plants, mosses still need sunlight, they need nutrients, and they need water for their photosynthesis process. Most of us consider mosses non-vascular. The reality is that they don't have any lignin. That's getting kind of detailed, but for the best part of tonight, we'll just say they're non-vascular, which means they don't have a way to suck up nutrients or water through roots and then transport it through the inside of the plant. The roots, what appear to be roots, aren't. Instead, they are actually rhizoids. The purpose of a rhizoid is to just help hold the moss to the substrate or the surface. Mosses do have water-conducting cells, and they have something that's pretty unique. Their leaves don't have a cuticle. Now, a cuticle is a waxy substance that covers a leaf. Now, I don't know where you live, but most common one that I like to point out around here is a rhododendron leaf, which is real obvious. It's got such a thick cuticle. The purpose of a cuticle is when the rain hits it, it falls off the leaf, goes to the ground, gets to the roots. Mosses don't have roots because instead they have these leaves without a cuticle, and the leaves are only one cell layer thick. So mosses hydrate and eat directly through their leaves. And, y'all, all they eat is dust particles. I mentioned early on that mosses had survived through the ages to still be here on planet Earth. They do have internal phenolic compounds that protect them. This is, instead of trying to grow big, their efforts were put into survival. In addition, there's several different compounds that are valuable. First, the one that keeps them from freezing. It's just like a built-in antifreeze. Certain mosses, including ceratodon, which can grow on top of a roof with high heat index in a city, also grows in Antarctica. Mosses are immune to diseases. They just are not susceptible to some of the woes that all you vascular gardeners have to deal with. Oh, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with all those plants. Anyhow, they also taste bad to typical garden pests. However, many valuable insects and invertebrates, salamanders, do make their own habitat in the cool mosses. Finally, for people that have to deal with deer, you'll be pleased to know that they're deer resistant. They don't eat them. They might stomp around on them and disturb them a little bit, but that's about all. In terms of moss botany, I'm not going to get too detailed on this, but this is quite different from regular plants. Mosses have a two-stage cycle. In the first stage, the plants, which are called gametes, actually have sex. Yes, indeedy, they have the sperm. It swims its way, that's another reason moisture is valuable, over to the egg. But instead of making a baby plant, it goes into a second stage. And during this stage, the sporophyte appears. And then the spores accumulate and mature in the capsule. Mosses can reproduce two other ways, though. They have the ability to grow from plant fragments. It's almost like a cloning. And they can be tiny little fragments, having the ability to generate new growth. Finally, there's a third way, and that's with Jimmy cups and propagule balls, and I'm not going to go into all that detail. It's just too much. Wind, rain, critters, all are credited with dispersing spores, fragments, and the propagules. And I already mentioned. I think I got ahead of myself there for a second. Sorry about that, about the invertebrates. Now, what does all this botany mean for a moss gardener? Well, first of all, if they're immune to pests and diseases, and they don't need much to eat but dust particles, then you don't need to use any chemicals at all. And groundwater contamination is therefore eliminated. Because mosses hydrate so quickly through that one cell layer thick leaf, the watering sessions, although they should be frequent, can be quite brief. Finally, the leaves and the way the colonies are put together or grow together help to slow down any rushing storm waters because they're flowing through the leaves and they reach for the groundwater table at a much slower pace. In terms of erosion control, mosses can be used on steep hillsides, particularly where it's hard to mow, and on nutrient-poor soils, and they're great for remediating soggy spots. One of my favorite things as a gardener is that you don't have to dig holes, and you can plant mosses on all kinds of substrates. And for those people that really enjoy gardening and just are sitting back now, twiddling their thumbs, hoping spring will come soon, if you garden with mosses, you can do it year-round in all planting zones. Well, it's break. I wanted to let you know that it's time to take a little question and answer break, but keep this in mind. We'll be covering more topics such as environmental benefits, acquiring mosses. We'll go through some moss identification, planting methods, maintenance, and more. And now we will take a couple of questions before we move on.
We have a few questions that have come in, Annie. The first is, how important is provenance in the success of transplanting moss?
You mean where they originally grow?
Yes.
Well, first of all, there are so many mosses that are universal. The same species can be found across the United States, or one that's very similar. The biggest consideration is the microclimate and replicating that, and perhaps addressing the soil or pH issues, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yes, it's like you can grow a tulip in North Carolina even if it comes from Holland.
Okay. So here's a similar follow-up question. You were saying it's important to replicate the microclimate. If you are rescuing moss, this question is, how do you rescue them, and then what do you do to relocate them?
Well, we'll probably be covering part of that in the upcoming part of the PowerPoint. In terms of that, it's really assessing the sun exposure, wind factors, and like I said, we're getting ready to cover that in just a minute. I think we might be jumping the gun on that question.
Okay. All right. And will you also, the next question is, will you be covering what types of moss can tolerate sunny location?
Yes, I will.
Okay. And
we're going to have a whole little moss ID section. Of course, our time is limited, and I can't go through all the species, but I've selected some that I think would be appropriate. It is important to consider the differences not only in the microclimate, but the overall geographic climate, and whether it stays hot all day long, whether it's humid, frequency of rain. There's so many different factors that I would take into consideration. But the reality is, as landscapers, we know how to manipulate an environment. So if you need more water, you provide an irrigation system.
Okay, and the next question is about watering. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that you didn't need to water for long periods, but you do need to water frequently. So what is the irrigation need for most of the mosses that you've been showing us?
Well, we're getting ready to cover watering, and you'll find out that I'm quite a fanatic about watering.
Okay.
Okay, and I will discuss that. I'm not trying to avoid it, but we will cover that.
Okay.
And the session length is based on the amount of that square footage and different factors in terms of seasonal changes, in terms of the heat index, and then of course you need to adjust based on the frequency of natural rainfall.
Okay. And the last question that we're going to take in this segment is, will your book provide reference lists for what types of mosses to use in different landscape situations?
Yes. It will have, I mean, the book's going to be like 275 pages. It's jam-packed full of lots of information and photographs. It includes an ID section with only, I think there's only about 30 selected moss species, but lots of detail is covered, as well as mentioning species throughout the book that would be appropriate for various types of locations or as solutions for particular environmental concerns.
And one last question has just come in.
All right, we got to get moving.
Yes, it's this can be quick. This is from someone who's focused on green roofs and walls and wonders if you're going to be covering any more information about the mats that you have available and whether or not they can be used effectively in green roof installations.
Well, the answer is no. I'm not going into specific detail about what are the wall panels or green roof substrates that I've been pre-vegetating that actually lay in. They're lightweight. No engineering is required to adapt the roof. Adding an irrigation system is advantageous. But specifically, we're looking at more general applications in landscapes tonight.
Sure. And just as a reminder to everyone who has questions at the end of Annie's presentation, she's going to be providing her contact information. So if you have follow-up questions after this session, you'll be able to get in touch with her and communicate and find out whatever else you need to know. So thank you, Annie, and let's continue on with your next segment.
Okie dokie. Thank y'all. And welcome back. Let's check out some amazing moss statistics right now. What single plant genera covers 2 to 3% of the world's landmass? Now let's think about it. That doesn't sound like a lot of land, but if it's only one plant covering it, what could it be? Da-da-da-da-da-da. If you guess moss, you're on the right track. But if you guess sphagnum, you get an A+ on this question and answer. And did you know sphagnum peatlands sequester more carbon than all the tropical rainforests put together? Along with trees, mosses are planet Earth's air cleaners. I just love it that mosses play this role in world air quality. Mosses live all around the planet in a variety of habitats and on all kinds of substrates. They can be in temperate climates or Arctic regions, tropical rainforests, and of course you're going to find them in bogs and fens and around streams or waterfalls. You can even find them at the beach, y'all. I have at least. high up in the mountains or down in the arid, dry deserts, there are species of bryophytes that live. And some of them truly are cosmopolitan and universal. There are a few that are very specific to a microclimate or a geographic location, but this does relate to that transplant question. The reality is that they can live wherever you want to plant them as long as you maintain the right care for them and choose the right moss for the right place from the get-go. Lest you be sitting there all frustrated because you're living in a concrete jungle of a city, you can find mosses all around you too. So let's cover some of the substrates. And if I ask you, I'm sure that this would be the first answer that I would get. Mosses live on soil. And they can live on a variety of soils. It does make a difference to the species. Some prefer better drainage and looser soil, even sand, or being on a hillside, whereas many other species are just happy to live on hard, packed clay. In the woods, you often find mosses growing on decaying trees. This is exemplary of the whole role of mosses in the forest life cycle. Mosses are nurturing to many little seedlings, and they grow on decaying trees. So they nurture new growth, they cover the old growth, the cycle continues. Mosses do grow on a variety of rocks and boulders. And I don't know about y'all, but I've never been to a waterfall yet that didn't have mosses all around it. Well, I guess I have to take that back. I've been to some of these man-made waterfalls that are so crisp and clean and stark, and if they have plants, they're some kind of unrelated plants, it looks like to me. It's rare that you find a waterfall designer that actually uses mosses for some reason. But, like I said, even if you live in the city, you can find mosses because they'll grow on asphalt and on concrete walls. Now, what do you think the pH is of all these different things I've been showing you so far? Oh, well, I couldn't even guess what a pH would be on an old leather deck shoe. Can you? So let's look at some of the environmental benefits. Living in the mountains, sometimes houses are built right up into the banks. That was the case with this house in Conestee Falls nearby. This section behind the air conditioner was solid clay when I saw it the first time maybe 3 years ago. And I gave the Vickeries a site consultation. They embraced mosses, and not only did they create a fairy garden, but they solved any potential erosion issues from ever occurring. They've had no water runoff, no slides from the clay, whatever. And you can see and imagine how much better it looks than a mud clay bank behind their house. In terms of erosion control, many people use mulch, and the mulches wash away. They have to be replaced again and again. Mosses help resolve that problem. And let's take a vote. How many people vote for brown versus green? In soggy areas or where you're dealing with water runoff, certain moss species are particularly good. I found Climacium to be absolutely the best performer in this case. Over here in the corner, I planted some Hypnum to start off with down in here, and it just sogged right out. It could not handle how much water. First of all, this irrigation spray head was leaking, And this is at a site in Georgia, and somebody else is handling all the irrigation. And anyhow, we won't go there, but the issue is that we've resolved it since we put in climacinium. Now, if you know much about plants, you know that native plants definitely have advantages, and it relates back to the issue of, is it better to have plants that only grow in your region naturally? Well, since mosses grow all around, we've got a leg up. The other thing, y'all, is that mosses are native plants. Let's don't forget to put them in that category and encourage native plant societies to recognize them and include identification of them on their hikes. Moss lawns. Now here we get into a good environmental benefit. Lawnmowers don't have very good emission controls, and it's only recently that they've added any to them at all. Well, if you stop mowing, you've eliminated it completely, and therefore you are now a champion for reducing air pollution. And although I mentioned that mosses like frequent watering, the reality is that grass lawns require so much more. You will actually be conserving water. Specifically, I'll go ahead and say something in terms of the watering right now. If I had a moss lawn, and I do, I have 3 zones set up, and I water for 3 minutes 3 times a day. Now, my system at the house is really simple. It's just a battery timer, garden hoses, and typical oscillating sprinklers. But on bigger jobs, I do use, installed irrigation systems. Once again, there is a variation between the amount of water that occurs from a pulsating head versus misters. Misters tend to saturate even more, so you would reduce the time. The way you figure out your time is to run an experiment. And here's the key. You water for a brief session to start off with. You guesstimate that maybe if you water at 10 o'clock in the morning, the next time you might need to do it would be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You can touch them and feel. If they are dry, then it's definitely time to water. If they're soggy, then extend your time frame and don't start your next watering session for a while. It's kind of a common sense thing. If they're already wet, they don't require water. If they're dry, you may have to decrease the intervals to where there's less time, or increase the amount of time that the water is turned on. But you really don't have to do it for very long. I can testify to that. 5 minutes in any location is going to be saturated. Moss lawns are gaining in popularity, and for good reason. They offer aesthetic, environmental, and spiritual appeal. This particular place, however, isn't contemporary in the sense that it was just created. This is a garden in Kenilworth in Asheville, North Carolina, and it was actually started 60 years ago. The people that own the property are wonderful caretakers, and they also own an incredible art gallery. Now here, let me shout out to my good friend Paul Moore over in Nashville, Tennessee. I think his moss lawn is absolutely exemplary of what most people want to achieve. And he's done this in 2-3 years, y'all. So he's got an article coming out in Garden Design magazine. I hope y'all will get it and appreciate his accomplishments as a moss gardener. You can see that he's starting to add in a little bit of interest with a new moss species over here in the corner. I'm looking forward to see how his garden continues to grow and with the textures that we expect to see. Now, somebody asked earlier about getting mosses, how you find them, rescuing, etc. First of all, it's important to realize that, and this is like a soapbox, I'm sorry, but don't take the mosses from our protected forests and parks. Where I live, there really is no need anyhow, because there's so many places that are subject to destruction. Let's define the difference between what I consider a rescue versus a harvest versus plain old stealing. A rescue is saving mosses which are going to be destined for destruction. It's where the road graders are coming in to widen out a dirt road and turn it into an asphalt one. Or perhaps where the roofers are going to put on new shingles. And we won't even go there about how that's an unnecessary event, but you get the idea of rescues. Harvesting would be at a place where you use responsible methods. You don't take everything that's there, because eventually one day somebody might like it or want it. Most often this is on private property. Stealing, the reality is that's just illegally taken mosses from public conservation areas. Now, if you want to coordinate a rescue, I suggest that you network with landscape use planners, developers, property owners, loggers, roofers, other landscapers who don't seem to appreciate mosses, and maybe even native plant rescue groups. Once, I even partnered up with John Deere. Can you imagine? Moss and Annie making friends with the people in charge of grass. Well, they were clearing out their greenhouse, and look at all this moss. And there was also liverwort here. So the moss was kind of yellow looking, was Philanovis, and the liverwort was Marcantia. Over here you can see it actually growing in between every single pot they had. Thanks, Ann Gordon, if you're out there in the audience, because I appreciate it when you helped me get them. You could join a rescue group that might be a native plant society, or maybe the master gardeners of your county get together, and you'll find the camaraderie and the pleasures of moss rescue can yield some incredible results when you pull together a community project such as this one at Silvermont Park in Brevard, North Carolina. We went out to a place that was destined to be cut down and made into yet one more golf course for seasonal residents. And we came back to Silvermont. I taught folks how to plant the mosses, and this garden was created 3 years ago in July. Still doing really well, too. Because if you follow right place, right plant, and translate it into right micro-niche, right moss, you'll be successful. The most important thing is to consider sun versus shade. Let's look at a few mosses right now. These are species you might want to take note of. Atricum angustatum is a star-shaped moss. You can see the gametes have a star shape. And look at these spectacular maroon patent leather looking sporophytes. Atricum angustatum tolerates living in shade or sun or partial sun. It's not that picky. And it also lives in the absolute worst of soils, along gravel roads, places that nothing else could possibly survive. Bartramia palmiformis. This is a fluffy moss, and it gets these really cool round ball-shaped sporophyte capsules that are reminiscent of an apple. So it does have a common name of apple moss. It keeps a beautiful green shade, but it's definitely a shade lover and pretty much a moisture lover. It would be a good choice to use around water features. Ceratodon purpureus. For those people that are interested in sun lovers, this is the king. The royal purple king, that is. It is a soft, velvety moss, and it truly prefers sun. If it's in the shade for long, it just does not perform well. It also gets spectacular sporophytes that are red. It does go through a stage right after the sporophytic one where the gametes turn a reddish brick color, and so don't be dismayed. This is normal, and pretty soon bright new green growth will reappear. Climacium americanum is my very favorite moss. I've mentioned it earlier. It grows a little differently. It's not exactly an upright moss. It has sideways rhizoids with upright growth. It can get to be quite tall in comparison to the ceratodon, which, by the way, is tiny, tiny moss. The climacium, although it's often associated with shade, can grow in the sun. I've seen it grow in immense grass and being mowed on a regular basis. It is truly probably the best grower from Fragments. When it's in the sun, it can get a gorgeous yellow daffodil color. And in the fall, kind of reminiscent of autumn leaf changes, it gets orangey tips. Dicranum scoparium is a fluffy mound-type moss. It's pretty much a shade moss. And it doesn't want to get sogged out. It doesn't want to get overwatered, that's for sure. And if it gets too much sun, it'll turn yellow. It does not want to recover once it's started going downhill. So, although it's a beautiful moss, sometimes it can be somewhat picky in the landscape. Hypnum imponens is commonly referred to as a log moss around here in the floral industry, and I'm not going to get on that soapbox tonight. It is called sheet moss. Well, I could say something else, but I won't. Let's get back on Hypnum imponens. It has a fern-type appearance. It's a shade lover, and it can grow on all kinds of surfaces, not just soil, but you can use it around rock walls if you're wanting to do it in the shade. Leucobrium glaucum. This one's often called pincushion, but the term cushion moss I avoid because Bartramia looks like a cushion, so does Dicranum, so does Leucobrium. There's a lot of different ones that are cushion-style mosses. This one has a light color. This is because it's an exception to the rule of the one cell layer thick moss. It lives in the sun or the shade, and it likes good drainage. Polypticum communi has the tallest of all the sporophytes. It's also very effective as a spreader from the spores. It will appear in new locations in your garden. It's also used very successfully as a remediation for erosion. And Rhododendron ontariensis has a cool rose-shaped floret, but it shrivels up into a kind of ugly brown nubbin. And we're getting close on time here. I better hurry it up. Okay, Thuidium delicaculum is very similar to Hypnum. Both of these two species will turn golden in the spring months in particular. It's a shade lover, but it tolerates moisture really well. Now, in conceptualizing your design, you do want to choose and acquire the right moss. You want to think about your complementary plants, and you can use perennials or some of your favorite annuals, maybe even natives, but you can use ornamentals. You don't have to have a native landscape with mosses because they look great in formal gardens as well. If you want to emphasize the miniature aspects, you might want to even create a whimsical fairy garden. In conceptualizing the plan, do consider erosion or water runoff issues. Here's a bit of advice. Plan ahead. Do not wait until the last minute to pick out your mosses. Figure out your budget in advance to avoid any cost overruns, and it's probably a good idea to involve an expert. You want to think about the shades of green because it's somewhat monochromatic, but they're pretty cool different shades of green, and then consider the colorful sporophyte delights. The textures will run from velveteen to fluffy trees, and the colony shapes can be a mound or they could be flat like a carpet. In your site assessment, you want to look at microclimate, moisture niches, sun exposure, anticipate the seasonal changes and the erosion issues that might occur, as well as soggy areas and wind patterns, heat index, and don't forget reflective surfaces such as white concrete buildings or glass. Clearing debris and removing weeds is your biggest task to get ready for planting. It's pretty easy to install mosses. It can be done in any season, even in the winter. We've mentioned moisture, and you can modify your environment by providing supplemental watering or setting up an irrigation system. Since they can live on nutrient-poor dirt, no fertilizer or good topsoil is needed at all. In fact, it's just a waste of money. Note I said dirt, not soil, because it's that cruddy, y'all. The pH, acidic mosses do like a pH of 5.5, but since they're calcareous lovers, it's not an overriding rule. Also, if you know, mosses live on all kinds of substrates. I've planted them directly just on fabric, and, well, I won't go into all of those, but the reality is that I'm not convinced that pH is that critical. There's several planting methods that can be used. Most popular is waiting for mosses to grow in. You better have an ideal location and plenty of patience if this is the route you want to take. If you do help Mother Nature out by providing some supplemental watering, it will happen much faster. There's a cookie sheet method, and that's where you use hand-sized colonies and scatter fragments in between. And then you water and walk on your mosses. My favorite is the contiguous planting method that gives instant gratification. It gives you complete coverage. For acrocarpus or upright species, just plant them really close to each other. For pluricarpus mosses, which grow sideways, you need to interleaf the edges. The pre-vegetated mats can make it very easy to just roll out the green carpet. They're also good in solving problems that you have where weeds or grasses are that you're worried that will keep reoccurring. In this particular case, there was privet, and you know how hard that is to get rid of. It's a good solution for soggy spots or water runoff. Here on the left, you see the carpet going in. Here it is in spring. And just for another look, here's the same garden in the fall. Uh-oh, there was a big tree that fell. So that may be some of your debris removal can be more than just minor. But in less than an hour, the tree was removed, the leaves were blown, and this is how good the moss garden's looking. The mosses were installed in February. This last photograph was taken in October. And even on big landscape jobs, you can enjoy the benefits of using pre-vegetated mats. I mentioned water and walking. I'm real serious, y'all. This is my mantra. Water and walk, water and walk, water and walk. There are a few details to take care of, like pruning, sometimes, that I do on big polytrichum colonies that have long tendrils. And then I'm just amazed at the bright new growth that comes out of it. The consistent watering is really important throughout the maintenance activities. Keeping up with weeding is important, of course, and removing debris. And then there's troubleshooting. Weeding. Ugh. What a chore. But don't neglect the weeds. You see what I'm taking out, that old weed called grass. But be aware of aggressive native plant invaders too. I happen to have a problem with houstonia or bluets. You can power blow the leaves away. It's best to do it when they're wet. Sometimes I actually use the hose and I power squirt them away. You can use a broom, but do not rake the mosses. They're not attached to the soil that good. They don't blow away or wash away, but you can dislodge them. And inevitably, you'll have to deal with some critter damage. It could be from the birds looking for worms. It could be that the squirrels have buried an acorn. And I don't know exactly what the armadillos are after, but I can tell you they're a pain. Sometimes I do resort to netting to deal with this problem. So, we're at the point now, we've talked about a lot of the aspects of moss gardening in terms of the aesthetics and the environmental benefits. But I would be remiss in not covering the most important one of all, and that's how we connect spiritually to Mother Nature, our planet, and to ourselves by being in a moss garden. So I'm going to be quiet for these last few seconds before we close. And I just want you to soak in some of these thoughts about mosses. Oh, I don't think you had time enough to read that one. Oh, and it was a good one. Bummer. Well, here we go. One more time. Your path to enlightenment could be a mossy one. I can testify that mine certainly is. If you want to learn more about moss gardening, or if you want to purchase mosses for sustainable landscapes, visit my website, mountainmoss.com. You can contact me directly via Gmail, and I hope that you'll go over and look at my Moss and Annie YouTube channel. It's brand new, and there's new, great, fun information. I do have a Facebook group, Grow Green with Moss. If you want to hashtag me, I'm Moss and Annie. And don't forget, if you want an autographed copy of my book, it's The Magical World of Moss Gardening.
The first is, can you really use a milk paint mixture to encourage moss to grow?
You can use it if you want to, but you're going to be very disappointed with your results, most likely. I've tried to give the moss milkshake experiment idea a good old college try on more than one occasion, painting it on various substrates, using species that I knew specifically could grow on those. I'll say that the buttermilk, if you're using that as a medium, or yogurt, or maybe even beer, all kinds of things are suggested, end up attracting critters. And Gucci Girl, the dog in this picture, thought that tasted really good, and she kind of compromised my experiment. The reality is that it's going to wash away in the rain. It's going to burn up in the sun. In all likelihood, the best you'll get is a tiny bit of green patina to some type of a surface such as a clay pot. Painting it on the ground, Lord, if we could paint mosses everywhere, I'd be doing it, folks. It's just very haphazard, and I certainly wouldn't rely upon it as a professional landscaper, and if I was a homeowner, I'd just be disappointed I wasted my time.
All right. The next question is, do you have to water moss year-round or only during the dry, hot summer months?
Well, you know, that's a matter of opinion, and you are talking to a watering fanatic. I happen to live in a place in Transylvania County that has the highest annual rainfall east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, you'd think I wouldn't have to water. Well, I guess I wouldn't have to, except on those hot days. But I can tell you what, mosses look better when they get enough to drink, and you don't have to use much. I do, like most everybody in temperate climates where irrigation systems can freeze, I discontinue any consistent watering, but in the winter months. But on warm days, I hook that hose back up and do it again. Some people have a totally different point of view, and that's that they're determined they're not going to water for any reason. They just want Mother Nature to take care of mosses. Well, that'll be fine. If you've got the perfect climate, then they're going to grow well. If you don't, then they're going to suffer.
Okay. So you mentioned water 3 minutes 3 times a day. Is there any moss that will thrive in a landscape that has no irrigation?
Well, you know, thrive is a matter of opinion. Survive versus thrive is the key. During times when they're dry, certain mosses, particularly even the ceratodon, which is a sun lover, is not going to have the saturation of green color. It's going to look a little bit duller. So the reality is that mosses are not xerographic, in my opinion. So I think, yes, you've got to have moisture that at least occurs periodically and be okay with them looking cruddy in between.
Okay. The next question is about converting a lawn to moss. Is this a topic that's going to be covered in the book that you're releasing?
Yes, it certainly is. It's a magnanimous effort, though. You can ask Paul Moore to convert an entire lawn. You've got to really work hard at making the grass go away. That's the biggest task, is dealing with the initial grass. There are ways to address it by killing the grass, by literally digging it up before you even try to plant mosses, or by using the pre-vegetative mats that you can lay down on top of it. But unless you do a contiguous planting, which of course, depending on the size of your lawn, could get quite expensive, most likely you're going to do a combination of letting the existing mosses grow in, using the cookie sheet method of colonies plus fragments. And if you, once again, the water is important, particularly when you're using these fragments or in this early establishment phase. If you water, they're going to do better.
Okay. And the next question relates to the vegetative mats. Can you give us a rough estimate of what the square footage price for vegetative mats would be?
Okay. Well, you saw I had one giant one in a photograph. I have standardized to a 6 foot by 6 foot size, roughly. It's a little larger than that. And the least expensive mat is with the Widium mosses, and it runs about $500 for 36 to 40 square feet.
Okay.
And price increases based on species, particularly some species will be more, and it's limited in terms of how many species I have growing in mats. I have more selection in container trays.
Okay. The next question is about starting moss gardens. How do you start moss gardens from old bunches of moss?
Well, if you buy old bunches of moss from a store that are all dried up, good luck. You need to start with fresh live mosses if you really want to have better success. And the way I started was I selected a target area, and then you don't try to do too much at one time. Create vignettes of interest, and gradually all my vignettes started meshing together to where my front yard is now 1,600 square feet of nothing but mosses.
Excellent. You mentioned water and walk. Does this mean that moss is not too delicate to walk on?
Exactly. That's exactly what it means. Doesn't hurt them one little bit. And they don't even mind weeding. I think it stimulates growth. But the walking helps the rhizoids to attach better. Now, if you're on a really steep hillside, you might not be able to walk. And I know this will be shocking, but I'm mean to my mosses, and I actually punch them into place. I'm not real strong. I don't have a real good right swing, but I yield as much power. Sometimes I kick them. I mean, really stomp on them. I mean, this isn't delicate walking when you're trying to get them planted. Now, if you have extensive foot traffic, that could be a factor that would affect the mosses long term. And if you have paths, I would suggest that you do have stepping stones, or that you use a gravel base as well with the mosses. And I had stones, little small pebble stones for a walkway. Frankly, the mosses are filling in now over top of the stone just from the random fragments that I toss away when I'm weeding.
Okay.
But they can handle some foot traffic, but not heavy foot traffic. Basic, animals walking on it's fine. But if they're going to run around like, wild dogs and have great fun, they're going to tear your mosses up. And kids playing on them, like you can't play basketball on mosses. You can go sit and enjoy it. You can see Gucci Girl doesn't mind sitting on the mosses.
Okay. The next is a specific question about weeding. Is there some particular technique that you use to weed without disrupting the established moss?
Yes, I actually do. No gloves, first off. You can't feel what's going on if you're wearing gloves. So I use 2 hands, and I spread my fingers apart and create a V with my second less used hand, and then I use my main right hand, and I wiggle the moss, the weed out gently. Now some pull easier. Some larger ones actually are easier than the little tiny get on your nerves weeds that you find grow in mosses sometimes. And then those that have horizontal root systems, you kind of have to nudge them and slide them out. You don't want to just pull it all out straight out. Now the good thing is that when you pull out a weed, if the mosses are really healthy and the colony is thriving, you may not even notice any disruption. If it does create a slight little hole, if it's a pluricarpus or sideways grower, just stretch it back into place. If it's an acrocarp or upright grower, just put a few more fragments in that spot, or a new little colony. If you can't stand to have a hole showing, You can tell somebody on this end might be fanatic about making it look perfect all the time. That's why I fit in that instant gratification of contiguous planting and not waiting for it to grow in. I tried to wait for it to grow in, y'all. I waited 2 years for that moss that was growing in the grass to take over. It didn't, and I changed pH and all of that. And I just didn't have that much time to waste. I wanted to see it now.
So when you are harvesting moss, do you recommend harvesting small pieces or the largest piece that you can, which is the easiest way to replant and reestablish?
Okay. First of all, you use the term harvest. I would say there is a difference. In a rescue, take everything you can get, y'all. It's going to be destroyed. I recently did one at an Audubon community where they were getting ready to repave the asphalt roads, and regretfully, I didn't get everything I could have. It was just peeling right off of the roads. It was unbelievable. I had a truckload in probably 2 hours' time. It was easy peasy pickings. I mean, you didn't even have to leave the roadside. Didn't have to haul it from the woods or anything. I think that it depends in terms of the size. Once, if you have access to big pieces, it depends on what you're planting. And you're not going to get big, huge, upright growers usually, unless you know, I mean, it's just hard to dig them and get big, huge pieces. However, with some of the pleurocarps, particularly those that live on the decaying trees, you can get long sheets of it. Most often, I will try to use as big a piece as I can. It covers a lot more ground. And then I just kind of stretch it around the edges, and I use the over-under interweaving method, and it connects together. If you want to try to make it go further, you pull that nice, big, gorgeous piece apart and make colonies out of it, and then use whatever fragments. I don't have the heart to tear up big colonies if you've got them.
Okay. One question relates to fertilizer. Could you clarify what you were mentioning earlier about fertilizer?
Well, you just don't need to use them. The reality is that mosses require such micro amounts of nutrients that if you fertilize, you run the risk of over-fertilizing, particularly providing a nutrient or a micronutrient that particular species doesn't need. There's a big void in terms of research regarding any moss cultivation and some of these factors that would be important to us as moss gardeners. But Michael Fletcher in the UK did do some of this, and he discovered, for instance, that one species that thrived with magnesium, the one sitting right next to it, desiccated. And until there's bryophyte-specific research done that separates the various variables of the different nutrients that you get in fertilizers, you might have a problem. Now, with that said, I'll admit that when I started out, because there wasn't hardly any information to turn to, and I just had to experiment, and I was determined to push the envelope and not just say, well, I have to replicate exactly where the moss came from. Well, the reality is that your yard may not look like the woods, and you're going to have some parts that are different. And when housing developments are done, they move a lot of fill dirt in. So you've got to deal with a lot of other complications when you're doing residential gardening versus trying to transplant into another lush wood spot. So there's just several factors that play into having success with mosses. And I don't know, I'm kind of rambling on that question. I think I might need to clarify it a little more. Did I cover it well enough?
I think you did. Thank you. We just have a couple of quick questions left, and I really appreciate you taking the time to address all of these past our 1 hour limit. This question is about watering. If mosses are not picky about the quality of water source, could you use recaptured or harvested water from a roof?
Yes. Lord, they grow so great on roofs already naturally, and that could be another whole topic, is how mosses thrive on asphalt roofs. And what nutrients do they get from the asphalt? I've often wondered that myself. Water quality is an issue as you go around the country. Apparently in the Midwest, there are concerns with accumulated salts. My solution or suggestion is to use a water filter. If you're doing that for yourself, then you could do it for the mosses as well. Mosses can live in all kinds of just horrendous conditions, though, and everybody I know has used water without any harm, but I have heard other people that have mentioned salt accumulation from other parts of the country. If the water's good enough to drink for humans, it ought to be good enough for the mosses. They've survived for millions of years.
And this next is a follow-up question. What about chlorinated water, city water?
Well, chlorinated water that meets any human consumption standards actually has very little chlorine in it. It's minimal and it has no effect on it. I have watered with tap water for almost 20 years now without any problems at all from the watering. If you pour Clorox on moss, straight Clorox, chlorine, it's going to kill it. But in the minute amounts that meet the standards and the regulations, and that shouldn't be a problem. Now, if you've got a well, you could run into some other mineral accumulations that might affect them. But once again, at my mossery, I have a well, and I haven't run into that problem. It is a consideration, and you might want to, try it out. But I don't think you're going to have much of a problem, folks. I think it's an over-concern, just like I think pH is an over-concern. I think the issue is watering or not watering.
Okay. And the last question is, you mentioned earlier growing moss from fragments. Does this mean that you can just trim moss rather than dig the whole plant?
Yep, it sure does. And I don't let any fragments go to waste. And I'm real pleased with my success with Climacium fragments that I have done in some new areas this year. It's amazing to me that they're growing from the tiniest little pieces. Usually what I do is with an acrocarpus moss, the upright growers, go ahead and use scissors and just trim them to little pieces that are anywhere from a ½ inch to an inch. No need to ruin a blender with the milkshake method and, to pulverize it into tiny pieces. Frankly, y'all, the more you pulverize it, the less it covers, because it's going to be so tiny. And then with pleurocarps, though, the sideways growers, you don't really have to use scissors. You can probably go ahead and just tear it apart.
Okay.
And now then you toss them on the ground. The thicker the coverage, it's an equation here, the better the growth's going to be. And because mosses are social and like to live in colonies, part of it is for moisture retention. So when you're starting with just fragments, then you're going to have the challenge of providing enough moisture for them to get going.
Okay.
If you're trying to grow from spores, that's another matter. Don't be victim to buying spores on the internet, y'all, that come in a little package. You can't see spores. So if you get dirt, the only way you're guaranteed in your little package is if you have a microscope and can recognize the spores. Most people that are selling it that way don't even have a clue as to what the species is. And I haven't heard of very good results from that method, and I can tell you that the moss milkshake method, the question we addressed earlier, comes up every time I give a lecture, and I've only had 2 people out of over 1,000 that can report any success. Most people go, yeah, I tried it, I waited and I waited, I messed stuff up, the buttermilk smelled. They go on with their complaints about it, but the reality is that they didn't have any success. Or they go, oh yes, look, 10 years later I have moss growing. Well, guess what? You probably would have had moss growing without painting the mixture if you live in an environment where the spores can attach and where the moisture is right.
Well, thank you so much, Annie. This has just been an amazing introduction to moss, and you certainly have inspired me, and I'm sure all of our listeners, to consider moss really differently when we think about landscape design. So thank you. Thank you again for your time and inspiration. And
thank you. And thank everybody out there for listening tonight. If you've got any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I do hope you too can enjoy the magical world of moss gardening.